Yorkshire, England, late spring 1818. The grand estate of Greystone Hall loomed against the moorland sky like a bastion of long-held power, its honey-coloured stone walls catching the afternoon light that filtered through gathering clouds. Inside the vast kitchens below stairs, where copper pots gleamed on whitewashed walls and the scent of roasting meat mingled with fresh-baked bread, Miss Ivy Marsh scrubbed a cast-iron pot with movements so practiced they required no thought. At 24 years old, Ivy had learned the particular art of invisibility. She moved through the kitchens like a shadow, her plain grey dress and white cap blending into the steam and bustle, her hands perpetually red from lye soap and cold water. The other servants barely noticed her anymore, which suited her purposes well enough. She had discovered long ago that invisible people heard the most interesting conversations. Above stairs, the house hummed with unprecedented activity. 50 carriages had arrived over the past 3 days, depositing 50 young ladies of fortune and breeding, each accompanied by mothers and chaperones and ladies' maids who regarded the below-stairs staff with varying degrees of condescension. The Dowager Countess of Greystone, a formidable woman of 55, with iron-grey hair and sharper eyes, had orchestrated what London society was already calling the most ambitious matrimonial competition in a decade. If stories of love found in the most unexpected places move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey through a tale of invisible hearts finally seen. You will not want to miss what happens next. Cook threw a ladle into the copper sink with enough force to make the scullery maids jump. 6 weeks of this madness, she muttered, her broad face flushed from the heat of the ranges. 50 misses, each one thinking herself the next countess. The waste alone would feed the village for a month. Ivy said nothing, keeping her head down as she moved the cleaned pot to the drying rack. She had perfected this particular performance over 13 years of service. First as a terrified 11-year-old child after her mother's death, now as a woman who understood her place in the world's grand architecture. Some people were born to ballrooms and morning calls, others were born to kitchens and cold water. Miss Marsh, Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, appeared in the kitchen doorway with the posture of a general surveying a battlefield. When you've finished with the pots, the library requires attention. His lordship has requested it be made ready for the afternoon, and heaven knows those London maids leave fingerprints on everything they touch. Yes, Mrs. Blackwell, Ivy curtsied, ignoring the knowing looks from the other scullery maids. Everyone below stairs understood that library duty was the closest thing to a blessing their harsh world offered. An hour away from the stifling heat of the kitchens, surrounded by books she could almost pretend were hers to read. The secret of her literacy was carefully guarded. Mrs. Blackwell, who had been governess to a merchant's daughter before circumstances reduced her to housekeeping, had taught Ivy her letters during that first terrible year after her mother's death. "Knowledge is the one thing no one can take from a woman," the housekeeper had said, her voice fierce with conviction. "Guard it carefully, child. The world punishes what it cannot control." Ivy dried her hands on her apron and made her way through the servant passages that honeycombed the great house, moving with the swift efficiency of someone who knew every shortcut and hidden stair. The sounds of feminine laughter drifted down from the drawing rooms above, punctuated by the deeper tones of masculine voices. Lord Greystone, the Earl whose future wife was being selected like livestock at market, had returned from London that morning with a party of gentlemen friends, additional entertainment, for the extended house party that would decide his fate. The library occupied the eastern wing of the house, a magnificent room 2 stories high with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a gallery that ran along 3 walls. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows that overlooked the rose gardens, painting the Persian carpets in shades of amber and gold. Ivy paused in the doorway, breathing in the particular scent of leather, paper, and beeswax. She worked quickly, running her cloth over mahogany tables and marble busts, straightening volumes that careless hands had left askew. Her fingers lingered on a collection of Wordsworth, remembering the previous week when she had stolen 20 minutes to read Tintern Abbey while the family dined. The words had stayed with her for days, that sense of something sublime in nature that transcended the grinding reality of daily existence. "Does the poetry speak to you, or do you merely admire the binding?" The voice behind her was male, cultured, and entirely unexpected. Ivy spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, the Wordsworth volume still clutched in her traitorous hands. Lord Greystone stood near the door to the gallery stairs, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He was tall, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and grey eyes that suggested intelligence rather than mere breeding. His riding clothes were dusty from the moors, his cravat loosened as though he had fled the formality of the drawing rooms as eagerly as she fled the kitchens. "I apologize, my lord." Ivy's voice came out steadier than she felt as she quickly returned the volume to its place. "I was merely straightening the shelves. That was not what I asked." He moved closer, his boots silent on the thick carpet. "I have observed you these past months, Miss Marsh. You touch the books differently than the other servants, as though they matter to you." Ivy felt heat rise in her cheeks, but years of invisibility had taught her when silence served better than speech. She curtsied again, deeper this time, and turned back to her dusting with hands that trembled only slightly. "You need not fear me," Lord Greystone said quietly. "I merely find it intriguing that one should care so deeply for the contents of these shelves." "You are very kind, my lord." The formal words fell from her lips automatically, the shield she had learned to raise against any kindness that might prove dangerous. She had seen what happened to girls who forgot their place, who mistook a moment of gentle attention for something more substantial than air. He was silent for a moment, and she thought perhaps he would leave, return to the drawing rooms and the 50 young ladies who represented appropriate matches, women with dowries and connections and the correct number of grandparents in the peerage. Instead, she heard him cross to one of the deep leather chairs near the window. "Tell me, Miss Marsh, what do you think of Wordsworth?" The question was so unexpected, so entirely improper, that for a moment Ivy forgot the careful rules that governed her existence. She looked up, meeting those grey eyes directly for the first time, and saw in them something that looked almost like loneliness. It was then that everything changed, though neither of them knew it yet. The afternoon light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, throwing the library into shadow, and then brightness again. Ivy should have made her excuses, should have curtsied and fled back to the safety of the kitchens, where earls did not ask scullery maids their opinions on poetry. Instead, she found herself speaking the truth. "I think he understood something most people miss, my lord, that there is beauty and meaning in ordinary things, if only we have eyes to see it. That a simple flower can hold more truth than all the grand philosophies of men who never touch the earth." The words hung between them, too honest, too revealing. Lord Greystone leaned forward in his chair, his expression intent. "Go on." "I should not, my lord. It is not my place to discuss such matters. And yet I am asking you to do so." There was something almost urgent in his voice now. "I have spent the morning listening to 5 different young ladies recite the same carefully memorized passages about nature and sensibility, each one performing like an actress who has learned her lines without understanding the play. You speak of Wordsworth as though his words mean something to you. Why?" Ivy set down her cloth, her hands finding each other in front of her apron, twisting the rough fabric between her fingers. The answer to his question was tangled up with memories of her mother, of nights spent in a tiny room above a bookshop before debts and death scattered everything to the winds. But she could hardly tell an earl about loss and literature, and the way words on a page had been the only constant in a childhood defined by its absence of constancy. "Because his poetry reminds me that I exist, my lord," she said finally quietly. "That even invisible people have thoughts and feelings and dreams. That perhaps the world's estimation of our worth is not the final measure of what we are." The silence that followed her words seemed to fill the entire library. Lord Greystone rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to her as he looked out over the gardens where some of his prospective brides were taking the air, their pastel muslins and Spencer jackets bright against the green lawns. "Invisible," he repeated, the word strange in his aristocratic accent. "Yes, I suppose you would be. We are trained from birth not to see you, are we not? To look through you as though you were merely part of the furnishings. It is the natural order of things, my lord." "Is it?" He turned back to face her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Or is it merely the convenient order, the one that allows us to sleep peacefully in our comfortable beds while other people break their backs to maintain our comfort? "My lord, I should go. If anyone were to find me here speaking with you like this, they would think—" "They would think what, Miss Marsh? That you are a person capable of intelligent conversation, that I am tired beyond measure of performing my role in this elaborate farce my mother has orchestrated." He ran a hand through his dark hair, dislodging it further from any fashionable arrangement. "Forgive me. I have no right to burden you with my frustrations. You have your work, and I am keeping you from it." But he made no move toward the door, and Ivy found herself rooted to the spot, unable to break whatever strange spell had fallen over the sun-drenched library. Outside, she could hear feminine laughter and the distant sound of a pianoforte being played with more enthusiasm than skill. Inside, the world had contracted to just the two of them, an earl and a scullery maid, speaking truths neither was supposed to acknowledge. "If I may be so bold, my lord," Ivy heard herself say, "why do you remain here if the situation distresses you so?" "Because I am the Earl of Greystone," he answered simply. "Because my father died 3 years ago and left me with responsibilities I cannot shirk, no matter how much I might wish to. Because an earl without an heir is failing in his duty to his name, his estate, and the hundreds of people who depend upon both for their livelihoods." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I am here because I must be, just as you are here because you must be. We are neither of us as free as we might wish." The comparison was absurd, of course. An earl comparing his situation to that of a scullery maid was like comparing a gilded cage to a coal cellar. And yet, watching the weariness in his face, the way his shoulders seemed to bear a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden, Ivy found herself wondering if perhaps captivity came in more forms than she had previously imagined. "I should return to my work, my lord," she said softly, "but I thank you for your kindness in speaking with me as though I were a person whose thoughts mattered." "They do matter, Miss Marsh." The words were fierce, almost angry. "They matter a great deal more than the rehearsed pleasantries I shall be subjected to at dinner this evening. I wonder if you might do me a very great favor." Ivy's heart hammered in her chest. "My lord?" "The library requires cataloguing. Many of these volumes have not been properly organized since my grandfather's time, and I fear I lack the patience for such detailed work. Would you be willing to undertake the task? It would require several hours each day, away from your other duties. I would of course speak to Mrs. Blackwell about adjusting your responsibilities accordingly." It was the most generous trap Ivy had ever been offered. Hours alone in the library, surrounded by books, freed from the endless scrubbing and hauling that defined her days. And the cost would be proximity to this man who spoke to her as though she were human, who asked her opinions as though they held value, who looked at her with eyes that saw rather than looked through. "I would be honored to assist, my lord," she heard herself say, though every instinct screamed that this path led nowhere safe. "Excellent." His smile was genuine now, transforming his rather severe features into something approaching warmth. "We shall begin tomorrow afternoon after luncheon. I find the house most peaceful then, when everyone else is engaged in their various pursuits." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her. "And Miss Marsh? You need not fear me. I am not in the habit of taking advantage of servants who have no power to refuse my requests. I simply wish to have one corner of my life where I might speak honestly with someone who does not view me as either a title to be won or a duty to be fulfilled, and I will ensure no harm comes to you through my carelessness." Then he was gone, leaving Ivy alone in the library with her racing heart and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that she had just agreed to something that could not possibly end well. The days that followed brought an unexpected shift in Ivy's carefully ordered world. True to his word, Lord Greystone had spoken to Mrs. Blackwell, who had regarded Ivy with an expression that mingled concern and calculation, before agreeing that the library cataloguing was a suitable task for a servant who could read. The other scullery maids whispered behind their hands, envious and suspicious by turns, while Cook merely shook her head and muttered about girls who got ideas above their station. For 3 hours each afternoon, she escaped the suffocating heat of the kitchens and entered a world of leather bindings and gold-tooled spines, of philosophy and poetry, and histories of places she would never see. And for those 3 hours, Lord Greystone joined her, ostensibly to assist with decisions about organization, but in reality to talk about everything and nothing in ways that felt dangerously close to friendship. They discussed Wordsworth and Coleridge, debated the merits of Milton versus Shakespeare, argued over whether natural philosophy or history provided better insight into the human condition. He told her about his years at Oxford, about riding across the moors as a boy, and believing he could see all the way to Scotland if he climbed high enough. She told him about her mother, who had once worked in a bookshop and taught her daughter to love words before consumption took her at the age of 32. "And your father?" Lord Greystone asked one afternoon as they worked side by side at the long library table, sorting volumes of natural history by publication date. "Gone before my mother died," Ivy answered, keeping her voice steady through long practice. "Debts, I believe, though mother never spoke of it directly. One day he was there. The next he had vanished to the continent or perhaps America. We never knew for certain." "I am sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been terribly difficult for both of you." "We managed. Mother found work where she could, and after she died, Mrs. Blackwell took me in at Greystone Hall. I have been fortunate in my own way, my lord. Many orphans fare far worse." "Fortunate?" He set down the volume he had been examining and turned to look at her directly. "Is that truly how you see your circumstances, Miss Marsh? As fortunate?" Ivy met his gaze, surprised by the intensity she found there. "Compared to starvation or the workhouse, yes, my lord. I have a place to sleep, food to eat, and work that keeps me too busy to dwell over much on what might have been. Is that not the very definition of good fortune? It is the definition of having learned to expect so little that even cruelty looks like kindness," he said, his voice rougher than she had yet heard it. "You should have had the chance to become more than a scullery maid, Miss Marsh. Your mind, your love of learning, your understanding of the written word, these are not common gifts. They should have been cultivated, not buried beneath pots and lye soap." The word struck something in Ivy's chest that she had spent years carefully guarding against hope. She looked away, focusing on the book in her own hands, a botanical treatise with beautiful hand-colored plates of wildflowers that grew in English meadows. "We do not all have the luxury of choosing our paths, my lord. I am what I am, and wishing otherwise serves no purpose but to make the present more painful. But surely you must have dreams, aspirations beyond these walls." The question was dangerous territory, the kind that led to unraveling carefully constructed defenses. Ivy hesitated, torn between the safety of polite deflection and the seductive pull of honesty this man somehow drew from her like water from a well. "I used to imagine owning a small bookshop," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something modest, in a village somewhere, where I might spend my days surrounded by stories and sell them to people who loved them as I do. But such fantasies are childish. I have no means to purchase even the smallest shop, and no respectable publisher would extend credit to a former scullery maid. So I content myself with borrowed time in borrowed libraries and try to be grateful for even that small mercy." When she looked up, she found Lord Greystone watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken in ways she knew were entirely inappropriate. His grey eyes held something that looked almost like pain, as though her modest dreams caused him personal distress. "If things were different," he began. He stopped, shaking his head. "Forgive me. That is a useless beginning to any sentence. Things are what they are, and we must both navigate the worlds we inhabit as best we can. What would you change, my lord, if you could?" The question escaped before Ivy could stop it. Too personal, too presumptuous. "Forgive me, I should not have asked." "No, it is a fair question." He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to her as he looked out over the gardens, where several of his prospective brides walked arm in arm, their muslins bright against the grass. "I would change the assumption that a title defines the entirety of a person's worth and purpose. I would choose my friends and companions based on their character and intellect rather than their bloodlines. I would read poetry in the afternoon without feeling that I was neglecting my duties to the estate and the family name." He turned back to face her, and there was something raw in his expression now unguarded. "And I would speak honestly with someone who values ideas over position, who reads Wordsworth not because it is fashionable, but because the words mean something true. I would have conversations that matter, rather than performances designed to demonstrate breeding and accomplishment. The air between them seemed to thicken with something Ivy dared not name. She rose from her own chair, putting the table between them like a barrier against the pull she felt toward this man who should have remained forever beyond her reach. You have 50 young ladies upstairs who would gladly provide you with conversation, my lord. Ladies of appropriate station, with dowries and connections, and all the accomplishments your mother considers essential in a countess. Surely among them you might find someone who shares your interests. I might, he agreed, if I could tell which of their practiced responses were genuine and which were carefully rehearsed performances designed to catch an earl. Do you know what it is to be perpetually uncertain whether people value you or merely what you represent? To wonder if a smile is real or calculated, to suspect that every pleasant word is weighed and measured for its potential return. No, my lord, Ivy said honestly. No one has ever valued me enough to perform for my benefit. In that regard, at least, I have been spared your particular burden. The words came out more bitter than she had intended, and she saw him flinch as though she had struck him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the library table, stacked with books that represented all the learning and culture that should have kept them perpetually in separate worlds. Miss Marsh, he said finally, I must ask you something, though I fear the answer may complicate matters between us. Ivy's heart hammered against her ribs. My lord, do you find these afternoons as valuable as I do? These conversations, this time away from the demands of our respective roles, does it matter to you as it matters to me? The question hung between them, weighted with implications that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Ivy knew the safe answer, the proper answer, the response that would maintain the careful distance between earl and servant. But something in his expression, in the vulnerability she saw there, called forth truth rather than prudence. Yes, my lord, she whispered. These hours have become the part of my day I most anticipate. I know I should not say so, should not admit to feelings that are entirely inappropriate given the vast distance between our stations. But you asked for honesty, and I find I cannot lie to you, not about this. The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch into eternity. Lord Greystone circled the table slowly, stopping an arm's length from where she stood frozen, unable to retreat and unwilling to advance. His grey eyes searched her face as though memorizing features he might never see again. What if distance between stations mattered less than distance between souls? He asked softly. What if there existed a world where a woman's worth was measured by her character rather than her birth, where intelligence and kindness meant more than bloodlines and dowries? Then it would be a world we do not inhabit, my lord. Ivy forced herself to meet his gaze, to speak the truth even as it broke something in her chest. You are the Earl of Greystone. In 6 weeks' time you will choose a bride from among the 50 young ladies your mother has assembled. You will marry someone appropriate, someone whose family connections will strengthen your position and whose dowry will secure the estate for another generation. And I will remain here in the kitchens, scrubbing pots and stealing moments with books when no one is watching, until I am too old to work and they turn me out to whatever fate awaits servants who outlive their usefulness. You paint a grim picture of both our futures, he said, but did not contradict her. I paint an honest one, my lord, and honesty, I think, requires that we both acknowledge the dangers inherent in these afternoon meetings. People talk, my lord. The servants gossip, and gossip rises through a house like steam from a kettle. It would take very little for someone to misconstrue our situation, to imagine impropriety where there has been only conversation. And while such gossip might merely inconvenience you, it would destroy me entirely. I would never allow harm to come to you through association with me, Lord Greystone said fiercely. I would ensure no harm comes to you through my carelessness. With respect, my lord, you could not. Ivy allowed herself a sad smile. I have no reputation to protect. I am a scullery maid, invisible to most and insignificant to all. But that very invisibility is my shield. Draw attention to me, force society to acknowledge my existence, and they would find ways to punish both the visibility and the presumption it represents. We do not live in your imagined world where character matters more than birth. We live in this one, where the price of reaching above one's station is paid in shame and ruin. She watched the words land, saw the truth of them settle over his features like a mask of resignation. For a moment, she thought he might argue, might insist that his position granted him the power to protect her from consequence. But Lord Greystone was, for all his philosophical questioning of social order, fundamentally an intelligent man who understood how the world actually worked. "Then we shall be more careful," he said finally. "The cataloguing will continue because it is genuine work that needs doing, and because no one can object to a servant performing assigned duties. But we shall ensure propriety is observed in all things. The library door will remain open. We shall maintain appropriate distance, and if anyone questions the arrangement, they will find nothing to support their suspicions beyond an earl who prefers efficient organization and a servant who happens to be literate enough to assist in the task." It was a reasonable compromise, the only compromise possible under the circumstances. And yet Ivy felt the loss of something that had not even fully formed, a possibility that had existed in the space between propriety and feeling, now firmly relegated to the realm of things that could never be. "As you wish, my lord," she said, curtsying with the formality she had briefly allowed herself to forget. But as she watched him leave the library, his shoulders set in a line of determination that suggested he was walking toward a battle rather than away from one, Ivy wondered if either of them truly believed that distance and propriety would be enough to protect them from what had already begun. The following weeks brought an uncomfortable education in the performance of normalcy. Ivy continued her afternoon work in the library, cataloguing and organizing with the careful precision of someone who understood that any misstep would provide ammunition to those watching for scandal. Lord Greystone joined her as promised, but now they maintained a careful distance, their conversation confined to the books themselves rather than the dangerous territory of personal revelation. It was agony. Ivy had not realized how much those earlier conversations had meant until they were reduced to polite exchanges about call numbers and proper alphabetization. She had not understood how much she had come to depend on those hours of honest communication until they became exercises in careful restraint. And judging from the way Lord Greystone's jaw tightened whenever their eyes met, from the way his hands clenched into fists when she maintained formal distance, he felt the absence as acutely as she did. Below stairs, the other servants had taken note of her elevated status with predictable results. Some treated her with newfound respect, others with barely concealed resentment. The younger maids looked at her with something like hope, as though her temporary escape from the heaviest labor suggested possibility for their own futures. The older ones regarded her with the cynicism of those who had seen girls with ideas above their station before and knew how such stories typically ended. Only Mrs. Blackwell seemed to understand the complexity of Ivy's situation. The housekeeper called her aside one evening after the dinner dishes had been cleared, leading her to the small office where household accounts were managed and servant disputes resolved. "Sit down, child," Mrs. Blackwell said, her voice gentler than the steel grey hair and severe expression suggested. "We must speak plainly, you and I." Ivy sat, her hands folded in her lap, her heart racing with the certainty that discovery had come and judgment would follow. Mrs. Blackwell studied her for a long moment, then sighed in a way that suggested both exasperation and sympathy. "I am not blind, Miss Marsh, nor am I stupid. I see how you return from the library each afternoon, how the light has gone from your eyes even as your posture remains impeccable. I see how his lordship's mood has darkened in proportion to the distance he now maintains from the eastern wing. And I understand, better than you might imagine, the particular pain of feeling something that can never be acknowledged, much less acted upon. Mrs. Blackwell, I assure you—" "Hush now, and listen." The older woman leaned forward, her expression serious. "I do not doubt your virtue or your wisdom in maintaining propriety, but I would be remiss if I did not warn you that others have noticed as well, and not all of them wish you well. Lady Constance Drake has been asking questions about the library arrangements, about how long you spend there each day, about whether his lordship is ever present during your work. She is clever, that one, and ambitious, and she sees you as a threat to her prospects." "I'm hardly a threat to anyone," Ivy protested. "I'm a scullery maid. The very idea that I could be considered competition for a lady of quality is absurd." "Is it?" Mrs. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. You spend more time in his lordship's company than any of the young ladies competing for his attention. You engage him in conversation about matters that interest him. You have access to him in ways they do not, and Lady Constance is intelligent enough to recognize that intellectual companionship might prove more seductive than all the accomplished performances in the drawing room combined. The words sent ice through Ivy's veins. She had been so focused on managing her own feelings, on maintaining appropriate distance, and avoiding impropriety, that she had not considered how her situation might appear to those with reason to feel threatened by it. Lady Constance Drake was widely considered the front-runner in the matrimonial competition, a beautiful woman of 26 with impeccable connections and a dowry that would solve several of the estate's most pressing financial concerns. If she viewed Ivy as an obstacle, the consequences could be severe. "What should I do?" Ivy asked quietly. "Should I resign from the library work? Perhaps leave Greystone Hall altogether? And go where?" Mrs. Blackwell's voice was sharp, with the practicality of someone who understood exactly how limited a servant's options were. "You have no references beyond this house, no family to take you in, no savings to sustain you while seeking new employment. No, child. You will continue your work as assigned. You will maintain perfect propriety in all things, and you will give Lady Constance no ammunition whatsoever to use against you. And you will remember always that whatever his lordship might feel or wish he could feel, his duty lies elsewhere, and cannot be avoided no matter how much he might wish it otherwise." The words were harsh, but not unkind, delivered with the certainty of someone who had learned similar lessons long ago and survived them. Ivy nodded slowly, blinking against the burning in her eyes that threatened to become tears she could not afford to shed. "I understand, Mrs. Blackwell. Thank you for your concern and your wisdom. One more thing, Miss Marsh." The housekeeper's voice softened slightly. "Do not think too harshly of yourself for feeling what you feel. The heart acknowledges no boundaries of birth or station, and there is no shame in valuing kindness and intelligence when they are offered freely. The shame lies only in allowing such feelings to lead you to choices that would bring you harm. You are a good girl with a good mind, and you deserve better than what this world has given you. But deserving and receiving are not the same thing, and confusing the two has destroyed wiser women than you." Ivy carried those words with her through the remaining hours of the evening, through the endless scrubbing and hauling that defined her existence outside the library's walls. She thought about them as she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the other maids snore and whisper in the darkness. And she thought about them the next afternoon when she arrived at the library to find Lord Greystone already there, standing at the window with his shoulders set in a line of barely controlled tension. "Miss Marsh," he said without turning around, "we need to discuss something that I fear will distress you, but which I cannot in good conscience leave unsaid." Ivy set down her basket of cleaning supplies, her pulse quickening with apprehension. "My lord? I have been informed by my mother that certain members of our house party have expressed concern about the appropriateness of our working arrangement." His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the anger beneath it. "Specifically, Lady Constance Drake has suggested to the Dowager Countess that your continued presence in the library during my visits creates an appearance of impropriety that reflects poorly on the estate." The words struck Ivy like a physical blow, confirming Mrs. Blackwell's warnings with terrible precision. "I see. Shall I tender my resignation from the cataloguing work, my lord, or would you prefer I leave Greystone Hall entirely?" Now Lord Greystone did turn, and there was fury in his grey eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Neither. You will continue your assigned work as before, with one alteration. Henceforth the library door will remain not merely open but propped so, and Mrs. Blackwell herself will be present in the adjoining morning room during the hours of our work. This arrangement satisfies even the most exacting demands of propriety, while allowing the cataloguing to proceed as planned. But, my lord, surely such measures are unnecessarily elaborate. If Lady Constance objects, Lady Constance's objections are noted and dismissed," he said flatly. "She has no authority over the management of this household or the assignment of servant duties, and I have made that abundantly clear to my mother. The Dowager Countess agrees that the cataloguing is essential work, and that you have proven yourself uniquely capable of completing it with the care it deserves. The additional propriety measures are a concession to gossip, nothing more. That he would defend her so publicly, that he would risk offending a woman who represented such an advantageous match, filled her with a dangerous warmth that battled against her better judgment. "Thank you, my lord. You are very kind to protect my position here. It is not kindness, Miss Marsh, it is justice. You have done nothing wrong, committed no impropriety, and deserve no censure." He crossed to where she stood, stopping at a carefully appropriate distance that nonetheless felt charged with all the words they could not speak. "I will not allow you to be punished for performing your duties excellently, nor will I permit petty jealousy to dictate how I conduct the affairs of my own household. But if it creates difficulties with your courtship, then those difficulties are mine to manage, not yours to solve by sacrificing your position here." His voice softened slightly. "You warned me about the dangers of drawing attention to you, of forcing society to acknowledge your existence. I did not listen carefully enough, did not consider how simply treating you as a person, rather than invisible furniture, might threaten those who prefer the world neatly ordered according to birth and status. But I will not allow my error in judgment to become your punishment." The words were everything Ivy had not hoped she needed to hear, a validation that she mattered not because of any utility she provided, but simply because she existed as a thinking, feeling human being. She blinked rapidly against the treacherous moisture gathering in her eyes, fighting for the composure that had protected her through so many years of invisibility. "I do not know what to say, my lord. Say you will continue the work under the new arrangements. Say you will not let the pettiness of people who see you as merely an obstacle to their own ambitions drive you from something that brings you satisfaction." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an undercurrent of something that might have been desperation. "My philosophical questions about our rigid social order demand I act on my conviction. Say you will continue to provide me with these few hours each week when I might speak to someone who values ideas over titles, who reads because the words matter rather than because accomplishment in literature is expected of a properly educated young lady." Ivy looked up at him then, meeting those grey eyes that held such careful restraint alongside unmistakable emotion. The smart choice, the safe choice, would be to decline, to remove herself from a situation that could only lead to pain for them both. But standing in the library that had become her sanctuary, facing a man who had seen her when the world conspired toward her invisibility, she found she could not choose safety over truth. "I will continue, my lord. With gratitude for your protection, and in hope that my work meets your exacting standards." The smile that crossed his face then was brief but genuine, transforming his features from severe to almost boyish. "Your work exceeds all standards, Miss Marsh. It is I who should be grateful for your willingness to undertake such tedious labor." "It is not tedious, my lord. It is time spent among books and ideas and beautiful things I would never otherwise have access to." "How could I call that anything but privilege?" "Then we are agreed," he said quietly. "And Miss Marsh, pay no mind to Lady Constance's machinations. She has revealed her character through this incident, and I assure you it has not improved my estimation of her suitability as a wife, whatever financial advantages such a match might provide." With that he turned and left the library, leaving Ivy alone with her racing heart and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that whatever careful distance they had attempted to maintain had just been irreversibly compromised by his public defense of her position and person. The next morning brought vindication, in a form Ivy had not anticipated. Mrs. Blackwell delivered the news while the servants took their breakfast below stairs, her voice carrying sufficient volume to ensure all present heard every word clearly. "There has been a development regarding the library cataloguing," the housekeeper announced. Certain unfounded concerns were raised about propriety and appropriate supervision. These concerns have been addressed through enhanced measures. During afternoon library hours, I shall be present in the adjoining morning room, and the connecting door will remain open at all times. This arrangement satisfies all requirements of proper oversight while allowing essential work to continue without interruption. She fixed the assembled servants with a steely gaze that dared anyone to question the arrangement. Furthermore, any servant who engages in gossip or speculation regarding Miss Marsh's duties will find themselves seeking employment elsewhere. His lordship has made his position on this matter abundantly clear, and I have been given full authority to enforce it. Are there any questions?" Silence greeted her words, though Ivy could feel the weight of eyes upon her, some resentful, others curious, a few almost approving. She kept her gaze fixed on her bowl of porridge, maintaining the appearance of unconcern, even as her stomach churned with anxiety about what the day would bring. That afternoon, when Ivy arrived at the library at the appointed hour, she found the morning room door propped open as promised, and Mrs. Blackwell seated within, her lap full of mending and her expression suggesting she found nothing remarkable about spending her afternoon maintaining propriety for a scullery maid. Lord Greystone arrived shortly after, acknowledged the housekeeper with a respectful nod, and proceeded to work alongside Ivy with the same careful distance they had maintained for weeks. But something had shifted in the air between them, some acknowledgement of the battle that had been fought and won on her behalf. When their fingers accidentally brushed while reaching for the same volume, instead of the immediate withdrawal of previous days, there was a momentary stillness, a shared recognition of the contact before propriety reasserted itself. When he asked her opinion on the organization of the natural philosophy section, his voice held warmth that had been missing from recent exchanges. "I believe chronological arrangement makes most sense here," Ivy suggested, running her fingers along the spines with their varied dates of publication. It would allow readers to trace the development of scientific thought across decades, to see how each generation built upon or challenged the conclusions of those who came before. "Agreed," Lord Greystone said. "I had not considered that advantage of chronological over alphabetical ordering. Your reasoning is sound." "My lord is too kind," Ivy replied automatically, but she allowed herself a small smile as she turned back to her work. They continued in this manner for the better part of 2 hours, the silence between them companionable rather than strained, the occasional exchange of ideas feeling almost normal, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Blackwell worked her mending in peaceful concentration, her presence more reassuring than intrusive, a reminder that propriety had been satisfied and malicious gossip defeated. It was therefore unfortunate that Lady Constance Drake chose that particular afternoon to pay an unexpected visit to the library. "Lord Greystone?" The lady's cultured voice rang out from the doorway, her tone suggesting surprise, though her eyes held calculation. "I had not expected to find you at work this afternoon. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She entered the room in a rustle of expensive silk, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have required hours of her maid's attention. At 26, Lady Constance represented the pinnacle of what society valued in a potential countess: beauty, breeding, and a dowry substantial enough to solve several generations' worth of financial concerns. Her green eyes swept the room, taking in Lord Greystone, the scattered books, and Ivy herself before settling on the housekeeper visible through the morning room doorway. "My lady." Lord Greystone straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "I am merely overseeing the organization of the library, work that has been sadly neglected for too many years. Is there something you require?" "Oh, I had merely hoped to select a volume for this evening's reading," Lady Constance said smoothly. "I find myself in the mood for poetry, though I confess I'm quite lost among so many choices. Perhaps you might recommend something suitable." The request was perfectly reasonable, the kind any house guest might make. But Ivy heard the challenge beneath it, the subtle reminder that Lady Constance belonged in this space in ways a scullery maid never could, that her presence required acknowledgement and deference while Ivy's called only for apology. "Miss Marsh is far better versed in the poetry collection than I am," Lord Greystone said, and Ivy's heart stopped at the deliberate invocation of her name, the public recognition of her existence and expertise. "Miss Marsh, would you be so kind as to direct Lady Constance to the appropriate shelves?" It was a test, Ivy realized, for both her and Lady Constance. An assertion that competence mattered more than station, that a scullery maid who knew books deserved acknowledgement as readily as a lady who merely wished to borrow one. And it put Lady Constance in the uncomfortable position of either accepting assistance from someone she had tried to discredit or revealing the pettiness of her objections. Lady Constance's smile remained fixed, but Ivy saw the flash of anger in those green eyes, before breeding reasserted control. How remarkably helpful. I had not realized the servants here were so extraordinarily accomplished. The library is on the third shelf from the window, my lady, Ivy said quietly, maintaining perfect deference even as she recognized the insult embedded in Lady Constance's words. Wordsworth and Coleridge are toward the center, Byron and Shelley on the right, the older poets including Milton and Donne on the left. If you require a specific volume or author, I would be happy to assist. I am certain I can locate something suitable without further instruction, Lady Constance replied coolly. She swept past Ivy without acknowledgement, her skirts brushing against the hem of Ivy's plain grey dress, as though even that contact required subsequent cleansing. The awkward silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Lady Constance's fingers trailing along book spines, a performance of selection that seemed designed more to demonstrate her right to be there than any genuine interest in poetry. Lord Greystone returned to his work with studied concentration, but Ivy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened whenever Lady Constance made some small sound of consideration or pleasure at a particular volume. Finally, after what felt like hours but could not have been more than 10 minutes, Lady Constance selected a volume and turned back toward them with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Lord Greystone, I wonder if I might impose upon your expertise. I find myself torn between Wordsworth and Byron. Which would you recommend for a young lady seeking intellectual stimulation but appropriately refined sentiments? The question was designed to exclude Ivy, to re-establish the proper social order by seeking masculine guidance on feminine reading choices. Lord Greystone set down the volume he had been cataloguing and regarded Lady Constance with an expression that Ivy could not quite read. I fear that is a question of personal taste, my lady. Some find Wordsworth's natural philosophy more elevating. Others prefer Byron's passion and drama. Perhaps Miss Marsh might offer insight, as she has demonstrated considerable knowledge of both poets' works. Ivy's breath caught at this second deliberate invocation, this continued insistence on acknowledging her expertise despite, or perhaps because of, Lady Constance's attempts to diminish it. Lady Constance's smile froze entirely, becoming more grimace than expression of pleasure. How remarkable that his lordship values a servant's literary opinion so highly, she said, her voice like honey over broken glass. Though I suppose such unusual democratic principles explain a great deal about the, shall we say, unconventional arrangements that have become the subject of so much discussion among the house party. The only thing unconventional about the arrangement is that anyone should find it remarkable that I employ a literate servant to organize books, Lord Greystone replied, his voice gone cold. I wonder what that says about society's expectations, that competence should be considered suspicious merely because it appears in unexpected forms. Oh, I meant no offense, my lord. Lady Constance's laugh was light and utterly false. I merely find it curious that you spend so much time personally overseeing work that could surely proceed without your constant supervision. One might almost think you found the company here more appealing than that available in the drawing rooms above stairs. The words hung in the air like an accusation, the implication clear. Lord Greystone preferred a scullery maid's conversation to that of his prospective brides, a situation Lady Constance found both absurd and threatening. Ivy felt heat rise in her cheeks, mortification battling with anger at the unfairness of the attack. One might think that, Lord Greystone agreed calmly, if one were inclined toward baseless speculation and malicious interpretation of innocent actions. Fortunately, I prefer to assume the best of people's motives until proven otherwise. A courtesy I hope all members of this household might extend to one another, regardless of station. The rebuke was gentle, but unmistakable. Lady Constance's expression flickered through several emotions before settling on cold dignity. She clutched her selected volume, Byron, Ivy noted with dark amusement, and swept toward the door with her head held high. I do hope I have not kept you from your work, my lord. I shall leave you to your cataloguing and whatever company you find most suitable to the task. Then she was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words and dangerous implications. Lord Greystone let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Ivy had come to recognize as indicating frustration barely held in check. "I apologize for that unpleasantness, Miss Marsh. You should not have been subjected to such thinly veiled insults." "I'm accustomed to worse, my lord," Ivy said quietly, though her hands trembled slightly as she returned to her work. "At least Lady Constance directed her anger primarily at you rather than me. I suspect you will pay a social price for your continued defense of my position here. A price I am willing to pay." He crossed to where she stood, stopping at the careful distance propriety required, but speaking with intensity that bridged the gap between them. "Miss Marsh, I need you to understand something. Lady Constance Drake represents everything my position requires in a wife: appropriate breeding, substantial dowry, connections that would benefit the estate. My mother has made her preference for the match abundantly clear." Ivy's heart sank, even as she forced herself to nod. This was the reality check she had needed, the reminder that whatever passed between them in library afternoons, the real world waited beyond these walls with its inflexible demands and social requirements. "I understand, my lord. You need not explain further. But I find," he continued, his voice rough with emotion he no longer seemed able to fully control, "that I cannot contemplate a lifetime with someone who treats others with such casual cruelty, who views kindness as weakness and competence as threat, who would enter my household and immediately begin establishing hierarchies of worth based solely on birth rather than character. I cannot do it, Miss Marsh. I cannot choose wealth and connection over basic human decency, not even for the sake of duty." The words settled over Ivy like a blanket of impossible hope. She looked up at him, meeting those grey eyes that held so much frustration and longing, and felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble, despite every instinct screaming that this path led only to ruin. "My lord, you speak dangerously. What you feel now in this moment may not survive the cold reality of your obligations. The estate needs funds. Your mother expects a certain alliance. Society demands a countess of appropriate birth. These are not minor concerns to be dismissed for the sake of literary conversations, no matter how genuine or valued." "And what of happiness?" he asked quietly. "What of waking each morning beside someone I can actually speak to? Someone whose mind challenges and delights me. Someone who sees me as Marcus rather than merely the Earl of Greystone. Is that not worth considering alongside dowries and social expectations?" "Not if I am the someone you are considering, my lord." Ivy forced the words out past the constriction in her throat. "I am a scullery maid. I have no dowry, no family, no position that would make such an alliance anything but catastrophic for you. Your tenants would lose respect for their lord. Your peers would ostracize you. Your mother would never forgive you. And I would become not a beloved wife, but the source of your social destruction, blamed for every hardship that followed such an imprudent choice. Please, my lord, do not speak of impossibilities that can only bring us both pain." She watched the truth of her words land on him, saw his shoulders sag slightly under the weight of reality they had both been attempting to deny. Lord Greystone, having acted upon his conviction, looked suddenly and utterly drained. From the morning room, Mrs. Blackwell's voice called out with careful timing. "Miss Marsh, I believe it grows late. Perhaps we should conclude today's work and allow his lordship to dress for dinner." It was a lifeline disguised as propriety, and Ivy seized it gratefully. She curtsied to Lord Greystone with perfect formality, gathered her cleaning supplies, and fled the library before the tears burning behind her eyes could fall where anyone might witness them. That evening, as Ivy scrubbed pots in the kitchen's suffocating heat, she replayed the afternoon's conversations with the relentless precision of someone determined to learn from pain. Lady Constance's veiled threats, Lord Greystone's impossible suggestions, her own careful attempts to maintain reality in the face of emotion that threatened to overwhelm reason, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. This could not continue. Something would have to break, and when it did, she would be the one to shatter. But even knowing that, even understanding the danger with perfect clarity, Ivy could not bring herself to resign from the library work, could not force herself to choose safety over those few hours each week when she felt human rather than merely useful. It was weakness, she knew, selfishness perhaps, But she had been invisible for so long that the brief period of being seen, of mattering to someone who treated her as though her thoughts held value, it was more precious than prudence could dismiss. So she would continue. She would maintain perfect propriety, resist any further impulse toward dangerous honesty, and try not to think about how this must inevitably end. And if that made her foolish, well, perhaps Mrs. Blackwell had been right. The heart acknowledged no boundaries of birth or station, and there was precious little point in condemning it for feelings it could not control. What Ivy did not know, as she finally sought her narrow bed in the servants' quarters that night, was that Lady Constance Drake had spent the evening formulating plans of her own. Plans that involved pearl necklaces and strategic accusations, and the careful destruction of a scullery maid who had made the fatal error of becoming visible to an earl. The trap was set with the precision of a military campaign, its execution timed for maximum damage and minimum opportunity for defense. 3 days after the library confrontation, Ivy arrived for the afternoon cataloguing to find Mrs. Blackwell waiting with an expression that combined concern and grim determination. "There has been an incident," the housekeeper said without preamble. "Lady Constance Drake has accused you of theft. Specifically, she claims a pearl necklace is missing from her rooms and that you were seen in the hallway near her door yesterday afternoon when you should have been in the kitchens." The words struck Ivy like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending ice through her veins. "That is impossible. I was in the kitchens all afternoon yesterday, preparing vegetables for dinner. Cook was there and Mary, and half a dozen others who can vouch for my presence." "I believe you," Mrs. Blackwell said quietly. "But Lady Constance has made her accusation formally, before the Dowager Countess and several other ladies of the house party. She demands your room be searched immediately and that you be detained until the matter is resolved." "She planted it," Ivy said, the certainty settling over her like a shroud. "She planted the necklace in my room, knowing I have no means to defend myself against such an accusation. It is the perfect weapon. Who would believe a scullery maid's word over that of a lady?" "Who indeed?" Mrs. Blackwell agreed grimly. "Which is why we must act quickly and carefully. Lord Greystone has been informed and is even now demanding that a thorough investigation be conducted before any accusations are accepted as fact. But Miss Marsh, I must warn you, even if we prove your innocence, the damage may already be done. Lady Constance has ensured that half the house party knows of her suspicions. Your reputation, such as it is, has been called into question." Ivy's mind raced, trying to see a path through the disaster unfolding around her. "What would you have me do?" "Submit to the room search with dignity and cooperation. Answer all questions honestly, and trust that truth, if properly established, will serve better than any defense we might mount." Mrs. Blackwell paused, then added more gently, "And pray that his lordship's protection extends far enough to shield you from the worst consequences of Lady Constance's malice." The search of Ivy's small room in the servants' quarters was conducted with humiliating thoroughness, witnessed by the Dowager Countess, Lady Constance, Mrs. Blackwell, and over his mother's strenuous objections, Lord Greystone himself. Ivy stood silently as strange hands rifled through her few possessions: 2 additional grey dresses, carefully mended, a nightgown and clean linens, the worn boots that had been her mother's. A small prayer book that was the only thing she owned of any sentimental value. When they found the pearl necklace, carelessly hidden beneath her spare pillow, where even the most cursory search would discover it, Lady Constance's gasp of vindicated horror might have been believable had Ivy not seen the flash of triumph in those green eyes. "There, you see, just where I suspected it would be." Lady Constance turned to the Dowager Countess with an expression of tragic disappointment, perfectly calculated for her audience. "Your Grace, I cannot tell you how it pains me to be proven correct in such a terrible matter. To think that we have been harboring a thief in your household—" "Hold!" Lord Greystone's voice cut through Lady Constance's performance like a blade. "Before we draw conclusions, I have several questions that require answers." He crossed to where the necklace lay on Ivy's narrow bed, examining it without touching it. "Lady Constance, when did you last see this necklace in your possession?" "Yesterday morning, my lord. I wore it to breakfast and then placed it in my jewellery case when I changed for the afternoon." "And when did you discover it missing?" "This morning, when I was selecting which pieces to wear today." I immediately conducted a search of my rooms, thinking perhaps my maid had misplaced it. But when it could not be found, I remembered seeing this girl lingering in the hallway near my door yesterday afternoon. What time yesterday afternoon? Lord Greystone's voice remained neutral, but Ivy could see the tension in his shoulders. I cannot say precisely, my lord. Perhaps 3 o'clock? Certainly during the hour when she should have been in the kitchens performing her duties. I see. Lord Greystone turned to Ivy, his expression carefully blank. Miss Marsh, where were you yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock? In the kitchens, my lord, preparing vegetables for dinner. I did not leave the kitchens at any point between 1 o'clock, when I finished in the library, and 6 o'clock when dinner service began. Can anyone verify your presence there? Cook, my lord, and Mary and Annie and Thomas, who brings the coal. I was at the work table near the window the entire time, where anyone passing through the kitchens would have seen me. Marcus, surely you are not suggesting we take a servant's word over that of Lady Constance? The Dowager Countess's voice was sharp with disapproval. The necklace was found in her possession. What more proof do you require? Mother, I require proof that actually makes sense given the facts at hand. Lord Greystone turned to Mrs. Blackwell. Would you be so kind as to summon Cook, Mary, Annie and Thomas? I wish to verify Miss Marsh's account before we proceed further. The next hour unfolded with the methodical precision of a legal proceeding. Cook arrived, red-faced and defensive, and confirmed that yes, Miss Marsh had been at the work table all afternoon, hadn't moved except to fetch fresh water twice. Mary corroborated the account, as did Annie and Thomas, each witness making Lady Constance's accusation progressively less credible. But it was the youngest scullery maid, a girl of perhaps 12 named Bess, who provided the damning evidence. Summoned by Mrs. Blackwell's request for anyone who had been in the upper hallways yesterday afternoon, Bess arrived trembling with fear, certain she was in trouble, though unable to imagine what she had done wrong. Tell them what you told me, child, Mrs. Blackwell said gently. About what you saw yesterday when you were delivering fresh linens to the guest rooms. Bess twisted her apron between small hands, her eyes darting nervously between the assembled aristocrats. I saw the lady, Your Grace, she whispered. The red-haired lady with the green dress. She was coming out of the servants' quarters, which seemed odd because the guest rooms are on the other side of the house. She had something in her hand, something that caught the light. But when she saw me watching, she put it in her pocket real quick and walked away. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the small room turned to Lady Constance, whose face had gone pale beneath her careful cosmetics. That is absurd, she said, her voice rising. Why would I believe the testimony of a child, a servant no less, over my own clear evidence? Because the child's testimony makes chronological sense, Lord Greystone said coldly. Because Miss Marsh was verifiably in the kitchens at the time she was supposedly stealing from your rooms. Because the necklace was hidden in the most obvious location possible, suggesting either rank stupidity on the part of the thief or deliberate placement by someone who wanted it to be found. And because, Lady Constance, you have demonstrated repeatedly since your arrival at Greystone Hall that you view servants as either invisible or obstacles, depending on whether they pose a perceived threat to your ambitions. How dare you? Lady Constance's mask cracked entirely, fury replacing calculated charm. I am a lady of quality, the daughter of an earl, a woman of impeccable breeding and reputation. You would believe servants over me? You would destroy my good name to protect a scullery maid who has clearly bewitched you with God knows what low arts. I would believe evidence over accusation regardless of the source, Lord Greystone replied. And the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that you manufactured this entire incident for the purpose of destroying Miss Marsh's position in this household. The question is why you felt such action necessary. Because she is nothing. The words burst from Lady Constance with the force of long-suppressed venom. Because you waste hours in that library talking to a servant when you should be courting women of appropriate station. Because you defend her before your mother, before your guests, before everyone, as though she were someone who mattered rather than a nobody from nowhere with delusions of significance. I thought exposing her as a thief would finally make you see reason, would finally force you to acknowledge the utter absurdity of your obsession with this invisible, insignificant girl. The Confession hung in the air, stripped of all artifice and pretense. Lady Constance seemed to realize what she had said, her hand flying to her mouth, as though she could somehow recall words already spoken. But the damage was done, her character revealed in ways that no amount of breeding or beauty could disguise. The Dowager Countess drew herself up to her full height, her expression thunderous. "Lady Constance Drake, you will leave Greystone Hall within the hour. I will inform your mother that your visit was cut short due to illness rather than malicious conspiracy and false accusation, a courtesy you do not deserve, but which I extend for the sake of your family's reputation. You are never to return to this house or speak of this incident to anyone, on pain of my ensuring that every detail of your behavior becomes known to every hostess in London. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Constance's face crumpled, but there was no sympathy to be found in any expression present. She had gambled everything on destroying Ivy and lost, her true character exposed for all to see. She fled the small room without another word, her expensive silks rustling with the speed of her retreat. When she was gone, the Dowager Countess turned to Ivy with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "Miss Marsh, you have my apology for doubting your word, however briefly. You may return to your duties with the understanding that this incident will not be held against you in any evaluation of your performance or character. It was as close to an acknowledgement of wrong as a duchess was likely to offer a scullery maid." Ivy curtsied deeply, murmuring appropriate thanks, relief flooding through her that the nightmare had ended without worse consequences. But as the small crowd dispersed, leaving only Mrs. Blackwell and Lord Greystone in the cramped space, Ivy realized that while she had survived Lady Constance's attack, the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Lord Greystone waited until Mrs. Blackwell excused herself with a meaningful look, then turned to Ivy with an expression of such fierce emotion that she took an involuntary step backward. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I am so profoundly sorry that my defense of you, my refusal to allow you to remain invisible, exposed you to such malice. Lady Constance was correct about one thing. You have paid a price for my inability to treat you with the casual dismissal society expects, and that price could have been devastating had we not been able to prove her duplicity." "You have nothing to apologize for, my lord," Ivy said quietly. "Lady Constance's choices were her own. You could not have prevented her malice by treating me with less kindness, only by never having noticed me at all. And if I must choose between invisibility and the risk that comes with being seen, I find I no longer know which I prefer." "Come with me," he said suddenly, urgently. "Not to the library, not under the pretense of cataloguing. Come with me to the gallery, where we can speak privately for once without Mrs. Blackwell's well-intentioned supervision, without open doors and careful distance. I must say something to you that I can no longer keep silent, and I refuse to do so in a servant's quarters where anyone might overhear and misconstrue." Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that private conversation between an earl and a scullery maid could lead nowhere safe. But Ivy found herself following him anyway, through the maze of corridors and up the back stairs to the portrait gallery, where generations of Greystone ancestors looked down from gilded frames with expressions of aristocratic disdain. Lord Greystone stopped near the windows that overlooked the gardens, the afternoon light painting his profile in gold and shadow. For a long moment he simply stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders set in a line that suggested he was preparing for battle. "Miss Marsh, Ivy, I can no longer pretend that these afternoon meetings mean nothing more to me than efficient library organization. I can no longer maintain the fiction that your company is valued merely for your literacy and organizational skills. I can no longer lie to myself about what I feel when I speak with you, when our hands accidentally touch, when you share your thoughts on poetry and philosophy and the nature of human worth." Ivy's breath caught in her chest, hope and terror warring for dominance. "My lord, please do not say what I think you are about to say. Please do not make this harder than it already is." "Harder? Is it possible for this to be harder than spending every waking hour torn between duty and desire, between what I am supposed to want and what I actually want, between the woman my mother expects me to choose and the woman I find myself unable to stop thinking about? He turned to face her fully, and there was desperation in those grey eyes now. "I do not want Lady Constance Drake or any of the other 49 young ladies downstairs, no matter how appropriate their bloodlines or substantial their dowries. I want the woman who reads Wordsworth in stolen moments, the woman who speaks of invisibility with such quiet dignity, the woman whose mind challenges and delights me in equal measure. My philosophy demands a choice of character. I want you, Ivy Marsh, and I am tired of pretending otherwise." The words hit Ivy like a physical force, each one landing with the weight of impossibility made real. Tears streamed down her face unchecked as she shook her head. Denial and longing twisted together so tightly she could not separate them. "You cannot want me, my lord. I am a scullery maid. I have nothing to offer you but scandal and social ruin. Your tenants would lose respect for you. Your peers would ostracize you both. Your children would be tainted by their mother's low birth, denied opportunities they should have been born to. And I would wake each morning knowing that I had destroyed the life of the man I—" She broke off, unable to complete the sentence, but the words hung between them anyway, unspoken but undeniable. "The man you what?" Lord Greystone crossed to her, stopping just shy of touching distance. "Say it, Ivy, please. Give me that much, even if we can never act upon it." "The man I love," she whispered, the confession torn from her chest. "The man who saw me when everyone else looked through me. The man who treated me as though my thoughts mattered, as though I were a person rather than merely a function. The man I dream about at night and think about during the endless hours of scrubbing pots when my back aches and my hands are raw, and the only thing that makes it bearable is remembering that in a few hours I will see him again. I love you, Marcus Linden, and I hate myself for the weakness and the foolishness and the utter impossibility of it." The silence that followed was broken only by her quiet weeping. Lord Greystone swept her into his arms, propriety and station forgotten in the face of emotions. Neither could control any longer. "It is not weakness," he said fiercely against her hair. "It is not foolishness, and perhaps, just perhaps, it is not as impossible as we have convinced ourselves it must be." Ivy pulled back enough to look up at him, seeing her own desperate hope reflected in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am the Earl of Greystone. I am saying that I have a right to choose my own wife, even if that choice defies every convention and expectation society has trained us to accept without question. I am saying that I would rather have 1 year of genuine happiness with you than 50 years of comfortable misery with someone appropriate. I am saying that I love you, Ivy Marsh, and I am asking you to marry me." The world tilted on its axis. Ivy stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was jest or temporary madness, and finding only fierce determination and unmistakable love. "You are mad," she breathed. "This will destroy you socially. Your mother will never forgive you. Half the ton will cut you. The truth of the matter, Marcus, is that the regret of refusing you would be heavier than any social consequence. The estate needs money that only an appropriate marriage could provide. The estate will survive. My mother, I trust, will eventually find her peace with the decision, or not, as she chooses, and the ton's opinion matters less to me than my own conscience and my own happiness." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears that would not stop falling. "I am asking you to be my wife, Ivy, not in secret, not in shame, but publicly and permanently. I am asking you to trust that what we feel for each other is more valuable than what we would lose by acknowledging it. I am asking you to choose risk and reality over safety and resignation." Ivy closed her eyes, torn between the future he offered and the destruction she knew it would bring. Every practical consideration screamed that she should refuse, should protect him from the consequences of this impossible love by denying it entirely. But her heart, that traitor, whispered something different. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "if I agree to marry you, you must promise me something. Should you ever regret this choice, you must tell me honestly. You will not sacrifice your happiness to protect my feelings, because I could not survive becoming the mistake you made for love. He pulled her close again, his voice fierce against her temple. "I promise that will never happen. I promise that 50 years from now I will wake beside you and feel nothing but gratitude that I was brave enough to choose truth over convention. I promise that whatever difficulties we face, whatever social prices we pay, I will never regret loving you or making you my wife. Now please, Ivy Marsh, please say you will marry me. Please say you will give us both the chance to find out if love can truly conquer the barriers society has erected to keep us apart." And there in the portrait gallery, surrounded by generations of aristocratic ancestors who would have been appalled by the very idea of their descendant marrying a scullery maid, Ivy Marsh made the most terrifying and wonderful decision of her life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Marcus Linden. God help us both." The kiss that followed was everything first kisses should be and rarely are, tender and passionate, and filled with the terrible relief of no longer having to hide feelings that had been growing for months. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, both were weeping, and both were smiling with the particular joy of people who have chosen hope over fear. But the world beyond the gallery windows had not changed simply because two people had decided to defy its rules. And as news of the Earl of Greystone's unprecedented betrothal spread through the household and eventually to London society, the costs of their choice began to accumulate with devastating precision. The Dowager Countess took the news with a fury that shook the very foundations of Greystone Hall. Her voice could be heard through closed doors as she raged at her son about duty and disgrace, about obligations to the family name and the estate's financial needs. She called Ivy every vile name her aristocratic vocabulary contained, accused her of seduction and manipulation and social climbing of the worst possible variety. Lord Greystone bore it all with calm determination, refusing to engage in argument or defend choices he considered self-evident. When his mother finally demanded he choose between Ivy and his family, he replied simply that Ivy was now his family, and his mother would need to decide whether her pride was worth losing her only son. The Dowager Countess retreated to her private apartments and did not emerge for 3 days. Of the 50 young ladies still present at the house party, exactly none congratulated the newly betrothed couple. Some departed within hours of the announcement, their mothers citing pressing engagements elsewhere that suddenly could not be postponed. Others remained through the week's end, their faces studies in shock and fascination as they witnessed the complete upending of every social convention they had been raised to consider inviolable. Below stairs, the servants' reaction was more complex. Some viewed Ivy with barely concealed resentment, seeing her elevation as an implicit criticism of their own acceptance of station. Others regarded her with something like awe, as though she had performed a miracle that might somehow extend to make their own lives more bearable. A few, mostly the youngest maids and the older servants who remembered injustices too numerous to count, offered quiet congratulations and genuine wishes for happiness. Mrs. Blackwell summoned Ivy to her office the evening of the betrothal and regarded her with an expression that mingled concern, approval, and something that might have been vicarious satisfaction. "Well, child, you have certainly made a choice that will reverberate far beyond these walls. I hope you understand what you are walking into. Society will not forgive this easily, if ever. You will be scrutinized and criticized and judged by standards no duchess born has ever faced. Every mistake you make will be magnified, every social misstep used as evidence that you were never fit for the position. Are you truly prepared for that level of constant evaluation?" "No," Ivy answered honestly. "I am not prepared because I do not think anyone could be. But I love him, Mrs. Blackwell, and he loves me, and we have decided that is more important than the world's approval. Perhaps we are fools, but I would rather be a fool who tried than someone who spent the rest of her life wondering what might have been." The housekeeper nodded slowly. "Then I will tell you what my own governess told me long ago, when I was foolish enough to fall in love with a man above my station and wise enough to refuse him for both our sakes. She said that love without courage is merely sentiment, and courage without love is merely pride. You have both, child. That is rare and precious and perhaps just enough to see you through what comes next." What came next arrived in the form of London gossip, spread by departing guests and amplified by every drawing room and coffee house in the capital. The Earl of Greystone had lost his mind. The scullery maid had bewitched him with low cunning. The dowager countess was prostrate with shame. The estate would be bankrupted within a generation. No respectable family would receive them. The children would be unmarriageable. The scandal would never die. Through it all, Lord Greystone remained unmoved in his decision, though Ivy could see the toll the social ostracism took on him. Invitations were withdrawn. Old friends suddenly had pressing business elsewhere. His clubs politely suggested his presence was no longer welcome. The world he had been born into was systematically closing its doors, and he was losing everything he had once taken for granted. "We could still stop this," Ivy said to him 3 weeks before their planned wedding, her heart breaking as she watched him read yet another letter, withdrawing yet another invitation. "I could leave. We could say it was a temporary madness, that you came to your senses. Society would forgive you eventually once the immediate scandal faded." Marcus set down the letter and crossed to where she sat in the library, the place where everything had begun. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. "Ivy, listen to me very carefully. I am losing acquaintances, not friends. I am losing invitations to events I never enjoyed attending. I am losing the good opinion of people whose opinions I have come to realize are worthless, because they are based entirely on accident of birth rather than actual merit. What I am gaining is a wife I can actually speak to, a partner I respect and admire, a life with someone who sees me rather than merely my title. That is not an equal trade. It is highway robbery in my favor." "But your mother?" "My mother will adjust or not as she chooses. I cannot live my life according to her expectations any more than you can live yours according to society's determination that you are worthless. We are both more than the boxes others try to put us in, Ivy. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that character matters more than breeding, that love matters more than convention, and that happiness based on truth is infinitely more valuable than comfort based on lies." The wedding took place 6 weeks after the betrothal, in the small chapel on the Greystone estate, rather than the grand London ceremony Marcus's position might have warranted. The guest list was sparse by aristocratic standards, 20 people where tradition would have demanded 200. But those who came were genuine in their congratulations and unmoved by society's condemnation. The dowager countess attended, having finally accepted that pride was a poor substitute for her only son's presence. She was not gracious, not yet, but she was present, and in the small gesture of placing her own mother's pearls around Ivy's neck before the ceremony, she offered an acknowledgement that perhaps birth was not the only measure of worth. Watching Lady Constance's true malice be exposed had offered her grace a painful clarity. Character, even in a scullery maid, was preferable to calculated cruelty in a lady of quality. The servants occupied the front pews, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable at any other aristocratic wedding. Cook wept openly, and young Bess smiled so brightly she seemed to glow. Even some of the younger ladies from the ill-fated house party had returned, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps by the realization that sometimes watching someone defy convention successfully was more interesting than maintaining it. As Ivy walked toward Marcus at the altar, her simple gown elegant in its very lack of ornament, she thought about the journey from invisible scullery maid to visible countess. She thought about the costs both had paid and would continue paying. She thought about the uncertain future they faced together, the challenges that would test their commitment to this unprecedented choice. But mostly she thought about how his face transformed when he saw her, about the love so clear in his eyes, about the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached to take hers. And in that moment, Ivy Marsh understood that Mrs. Blackwell had been right. Sometimes love and courage together were just barely enough. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, traditional words given new weight by the circumstances surrounding them. When Marcus lifted her veil and kissed her, making her Ivy Linden, Countess of Greystone, the small congregation erupted in genuine applause. It was not the grand society wedding anyone had expected the Earl to have, but it was infinitely more honest, and somehow that mattered more. The wedding breakfast was held at Greystone Hall, a modest affair by aristocratic standards but sumptuous by the measure of Ivy's previous life. She sat at the head table beside her husband, the word still felt impossible, and tried to remember how to breathe normally as she navigated conversation with people who just weeks ago would not have acknowledged her existence. It was exhausting and exhilarating by turns, this sudden visibility. Every word she spoke seemed weighted with the burden of representation, as though she must prove herself worthy on behalf of every servant who had ever dreamed of something beyond their station. She felt Marcus's hand find hers under the table, a silent anchor in the storm of social performance, and drew strength from the contact. As the afternoon wore into evening and guests began departing, the Dowager Countess approached Ivy with an expression that suggested the conversation would not be entirely comfortable. "A word, if you please, Lady Greystone." The title still sounded strange in her voice, not quite acceptance, but moving in that direction. They withdrew to a small sitting room, and for a moment the two women simply regarded each other, measuring, evaluating, seeking some common ground from which to build whatever relationship might be possible between them. "I will be honest with you," the Dowager Countess said finally. "I do not approve of this match. I consider it reckless and potentially devastating to the family's standing. But my son loves you, God help him, and you appear to love him in return. That is more than many marriages of appropriate station can claim." "I do love him, Your Grace," Ivy said quietly. "More than I thought it possible to love anyone, and I promise you that I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the position he has given me, trying to be the kind of countess who brings credit to the Greystone name rather than shame." "See that you do," the Dowager Countess replied crisply. But then her expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been sympathy beneath the aristocratic facade. "It will not be easy, child. Society has a long memory and an appetite for judgment that exceeds its capacity for forgiveness. You will be tested in ways you cannot yet imagine, criticized for errors that would be overlooked in someone born to this position. But I have watched you these past weeks, and I see something in you that reminds me of myself when I was young, a determination to survive circumstances beyond your control, a refusal to be broken by the world's cruelty. Perhaps that will be enough. Time will tell." She extended her hand, and Ivy took it, feeling the slight pressure that was not quite warmth, but was at least the beginning of truce. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will endeavor not to disappoint you, or the name I now bear." "See that you do not disappoint Marcus," the Dowager Countess corrected. "That is all that matters in the end. Make him happy, Lady Greystone. Give him reason to believe this mad gamble was worth the costs. Do that, and I suspect even society might eventually be forced to admit that perhaps character matters after all." The months and years that followed were not easy, but they were real. Ivy learned to navigate the complex world of aristocratic society, making mistakes and learning from them with the same determination that had once carried her through days of endless physical labor. Some doors remained closed to her forever, certain drawing rooms where her presence would never be welcome, but other doors opened, particularly among younger members of the ton who viewed the Earl and Countess of Greystone as romantic figures who had chosen love over convention. Marcus stood beside her through it all, his support never wavering even when the social costs mounted higher than either had anticipated. Together they developed new patterns of marriage, relationships based on genuine partnership rather than the carefully maintained distance that characterized most aristocratic unions. They talked still every evening, sharing ideas and dreams and fears in ways that scandalized those who believed spouses should maintain appropriate formality, even in private. 5 years after their wedding, Ivy established a small school on the Greystone estate, offering basic literacy and numeracy to the children of servants and tenants. It was considered eccentric by some, dangerously radical by others, but Marcus supported the endeavor with both funds and presence, occasionally teaching history lessons himself when his duties permitted. The Dowager Countess, who had gradually moved from grudging acceptance to something approaching approval, endowed the school with her own funds and even occasionally visited to evaluate the children's progress. She never admitted to being wrong about the marriage, but she doted on her 2 grandchildren with a fierceness that suggested she had made peace with their mother's origins. On a warm spring afternoon, 6 years after that first conversation in the library, Ivy and Marcus sat together in the place where everything had begun, watching their children play among the stacks under Mrs. Blackwell's watchful eye. The former housekeeper had been elevated to governess, a position she claimed to find deeply satisfying, given that she now taught children who actually wanted to learn, rather than those forced by social obligation. "Do you ever regret it?" Ivy asked quietly. The question she had promised herself she would never avoid if it needed asking. "The friends you lost, the invitations withdrawn, the difficulties we still face in certain circles?" Marcus set down the volume of Wordsworth he had been reading, the same edition that had first sparked their conversation so many years ago, and pulled her close with the easy affection of long marriage. "Not once," he said. "Not ever. I traded superficiality for depth, performance for authenticity, comfortable misery for genuine joy. I chose a wife who challenges and delights me rather than one who merely decorates my life appropriately. I wake each morning beside someone I can actually speak to, someone whose mind I admire as much as I love her heart. How could I possibly regret that? Even when Lord Somerset cuts you in public, even when we are excluded from events you should rightfully attend, even then," he kissed the top of her head gently. "Ivy, I would rather be ostracized with you than celebrated with someone appropriate. I would rather have these conversations in our library than perform politeness in London drawing rooms. I would rather watch our children grow up knowing their parents chose love over convention than raise them in a household based on duty and resignation. We chose the harder path, perhaps, but it is ours, genuinely ours, and I would not trade it for all the social approval in the world." From across the library, their daughter's laugh rang out, pure and joyful, as she discovered yet another volume she wished to explore. Their son followed more cautiously, already showing his father's careful consideration in choosing what to read. Mrs. Blackwell watched over them both with the particular satisfaction of someone whose own dreams of education had been fulfilled through the next generation. "Do you know what I think?" Ivy said, settling more comfortably against her husband's shoulder. "Perhaps that is what love really is, not grand gestures or romantic rescues, but simply the radical act of truly seeing another person and choosing to value what we find there." "I like that definition," Marcus said softly, "though I would add one element. Love is seeing someone clearly and then defending their right to be seen, even when the world insists they should remain invisible. That is what you taught me, Ivy, that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to have their thoughts and dreams acknowledged as real and important, and that the accident of birth should not determine the entirety of our worth." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their children explore the library that had changed two lives so completely. Outside, the Yorkshire moors stretched toward the horizon, beautiful and harsh and enduring. Inside, surrounded by books and family and the hard-won peace of a choice well made, Ivy Marsh Linden, Countess of Greystone, felt something she had not known since her mother's death so many years ago. She felt home. "We are deeply grateful you chose to spend this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone special. Your support motivates us to keep telling stories full of love, courage, and the belief that sometimes the most invisible hearts hold the greatest capacity for genuine connection."